welcome to our Lunch and Learn today. I'm so excited to talk about our topic. Our topic today is generational differences in a mentoring relationship. Now, you might not necessarily be in a mentoring relationship with somebody who's a different generation than you. You very well might be in a mentoring relationship with someone that's in a generational difference than you, but you're definitely working with somebody that are of different ages. And we brought in a guest expert here to talk about how we can be our best selves, how we can improve our performance, how we can improve our mentor relationships by understanding the different generational gaps, and just ultimately how we can be more conscientious of how other people are feeling just because of, you know, where they grew up and when they grew up and essentially their perspective on life. So we brought in Stefanie Krievens. Stefanie is a coach that focuses on generational gaps at work and between leaders. Her specialty is in fixing hot messes. Stefanie, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Stefanie, let's talk about generational gaps at work. Let's talk about generational gaps in a mentoring relationship. I guess really starting off, what does it even mean? And what are some of the common things that you view as differences between generational gaps? I think naively, I think to myself, okay, just people of a different age, whatever, they can't possibly have that crazy of a different perspective than I do about work or life or careers. What have you seen? What are your perspectives?
Yeah, so let's start with the foundation of first, the three primary generations that are in our workforce right now. So we've got our baby boomers who are generally late 50s to early 60s and older. And then we've got our Gen Xers, and they are generally late 30s to late 50s. And I say generally because everyone you ask, from Gallup to different other folks who measure generational differences in the workplace, have a slightly different age range. I'm not sure how much that matters. That's why I just add ish on the end of everything. And then our millennials are our friends who are generally been born 83 or 85 through whatever 20 years beyond that is. And so they're now in the workplace. And there's amazing opportunities that we haven't had before in the workforce, but there's also a lot of natural tensions that emerge in the workplace because of these very different perspectives. So when you think about the childhood of a baby boomer, and what they experienced in school, how they learned, what values were important to them, how they probably had their first job delivering newspapers at the age of 8, and, you know, learning to understand what it's like to work for an income to maybe even help support your family from that young of an age. That is a way different experience than a millennial who was told, who had a fairly overscheduled life, who was told in order to be successful, you don't have a part-time job, you invest yourself in multiple extracurricular activities. This is how you get the A. Go to college, get in the workforce. They will tell you how to get the A in the workforce. Those are two completely different experiences of what it means to be successful. And then you add in Gen Xers, who we were like the free range children of the 80s. We stayed out till till the streetlights came on and we got in the house. We had a fairly high level of independence. And so we learned to solve problems on our own. We're sandwiched in between two very different perspectives. So then when it comes to the mentoring relationship, there's just going to be, in your all's language, a different orientation to work across those three different generations that unless you have common language to talk about it, you're not going to understand.
Well, it's fascinating you say that because, well, one, work orientation is fluid, but it can change throughout your life. And we do see work orientation changes as people get older and as they get more experience, but we also see people of different ages having different work orientations. Like I've seen people in their 60s having a calling work orientation, while people also in their 20s having a calling work orientation, working at the same company, perhaps in different roles or in different types of work, but for the most part, their work orientation is aligned. But how they perhaps got to that juncture of this is what I want my work orientation to be, or this is how I view my work, is different. So can we talk a little bit more about that? That's fascinating. I'd love to learn more of your perspective on this.
So which part specifically do you think would be helpful to dig into?
Awesome. I love to dive into the specific differences between maybe how someone who's, let's say, in their 60s comes to getting to a calling work orientation, but how someone in their 20s could also get to a calling work orientation, career work orientation, or job work orientation. Because I think that's very obviously specific to ambition and motion, but I think it's very relevant, and I think it's a very fascinating topic.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And when you introduced it to me, I was like, oh, this makes so much sense. It helped me better understand some of the folks that I was coaching. So a lot of the folks coming to me for coaching that are in that kind of upper Gen Xer realm, lower baby boomer, so let's say early 50s to early 60s age range, they have spent their life on the hamster wheel in the rat race, trying to earn the money, trying to have the house, trying to pay for their kids' college and save for retirement at the same time. And they're just done. They maybe had something at work happen where they're passed up for a promotion and they're just done with the rat race. And so, for example, I had a client with a big law firm come to me, and she's in her early 50s, and she knew she couldn't spend the last 13 years of her career in that kind of environment, running herself ragged for the billable hour. And not that there's anything wrong with the big law firm. There's lots of great work that happens there, but it's all about the billable hour for a lot of folks. And she knew she couldn't do it. And so she did want to transition to more of a calling, right? How do I do what my purpose is? How do I do something that I'm passionate about? Because she now better understood that what she spent her career doing in that work orientation towards drive at all costs really had just eaten her soul alive, and she refused. She knew she couldn't spend the last 10, 12, 15 years of her life or of her working life doing that. And so I think a lot of folks in that older generation, they come to it because they've spent not a lot. I don't mean to overgeneralize here, but there's a segment of that population that they understand that there's something bigger and better to work, because they've spent so many years trying to fit their soul into a box to deliver this work that they just know they can't continue to do. And then folks on the millennial end of the spectrum, the millennials that I see that really have this strong work calling, and again, this is just my perspective, doesn't make it the end all be all, is oftentimes they come from entrepreneurial families. So their mother, their father were business owners, and they understand that in order for a business to survive, you've got to put in a lot of work and a lot of long hours to be successful. And so they also have that orientation. They just don't want to be an entrepreneur. And so they apply that to their career.
This isn't, sorry, I'm going to jump in. I don't know if it's kind of a comment, but I think the baby boomers, from my understanding, is that the parents or the father, very traditional type of family, the father works, the mother may or may not work. And I feel that there was a shift somewhere in there that people went from working 20 to 30 years in a company, and something shift where loyalty with companies changed. And the next generation was like, I'm not going to give you my sweat and tears when there's no loyalty. And what was that? What was that shift? What happened? Because it happened to a lot of our parents. Yeah.
So the way I've been exposed to it is really the Gen Xers were the first ones to experience that shift in loyalty as companies drastically imploded because of a variety of technological change, environmental issues, and then global politics as well. And so Gen Xers were actually the first, as they entered their career, where they made trade-offs in their marriage. So we're going to move to Portland because I want this job. At the next job, you get to decide where we move based on what's important in your career. And companies were shrinking and growing, and folks were moving across the country away from their safety nets, their grandparents who could help watch the kids. Those were Gen Xers that first experienced that. And so I can't exactly detail the economic factors at play, but they were certainly the ones. And so Gen Xers actually get labeled as being disloyal because they job hopped. They job hopped because of the environmental factors impacting their career and the economy as they were coming of age in the mid-90s all the way to about the mid-2000s. And so my experience, Gen Xers actually are extremely loyal. They want to be loyal, and they know enough about the world to know they have to put their economic self-interests first in their decision-making. So that's what you hear, but they actually would love to be somewhere for 20, 30 years. It's on the employer side with the fluctuations in technology and the economy. They feel like they've been on the short end of the stick of that, not the employers.
So do you feel that Gen X are the first ones, if they catch wind, like this is kind of plays with the kind of work orientation too, they catch wind and they feel volatile and there's not engagement and communication and clarity, that their job perhaps could be at jeopardy. And instead of maybe communicating with someone, they're like, I'm going to start looking for my second place to be loyal, and I hope to God that somewhere along there I can land somewhere for 20 years.
Yeah, so the second layer that goes on top of that, Gen Xers are actually, they very much value the hierarchy. They understand the benefits of why you have a manager, director, vice president, president. So what keeps them quiet in that situation is that they very much respect the hierarchy. So they don't want to push too much. They want to challenge the status quo with the work, but it's hard for Gen Xers to challenge authority as it relates to the hierarchy. So you might see some of that, well, I'm just going to start looking because I'm not getting the clarity that I need. I don't know if they really want me here. I'm going to assume that they don't. I'm going to assume that I'm going to get my job eliminated like last time. I better get my resume up to date so I can be ready to split, because I got kids in college and I got to pay for retirement, and that doesn't happen on $50,000 a year.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
So what I'd be curious to know is, what can we do as leaders, as managers, as companies, building and managing teams and people? What can we do to stay ahead of this? What can we do to try to be conscientiously aware of the generational differences, how one might feel? Because I think with what you're almost kind of saying, Stefanie, is that I would imagine in that case, in that same situation, there's miscommunications going on both sides. I mean, you've got, perhaps a Gen X or even a millennial, a professional who's feeling maybe that they're getting passed over, they're not getting the type of recognition they want. And you've got perhaps leaders that are perhaps a little bit older that don't realize this is what they want. They don't realize that this is an opportunity for, as a company, us to provide an opportunity for these people to learn and grow. And then when they leave, it's a blindside. We're like, what the heck? How the heck? What, this person's unloyal. I can't believe they leave us. How can we go about being more consciously aware of these factors about how other people are feeling at work?
Yeah, so number one is we have to drop the stereotypes, right? We hear lots of disparaging things about millennials, and luckily that conversation is starting to subside a little bit. But, that's been happening for 10, almost 15 years now. And luckily they're moving up into leadership, and we're seeing the benefits of that. So number one, drop the stereotypes. Number two is have a one-on-one conversation about what motivates your people. A millennial might value flexibility because they've got toddlers at home and in daycare that they're, trying to see for at least 2 hours a night between pickup from daycare and them going to bed. Same for a Gen Xer. They might need flexibility because they got to take their kid to college this week. And then after that, they're moving their mom into an assisted living facility. That's the sandwich of their life. And so having a one-on-one conversation about what people need in order to stay at your company is unbelievably crucial. And it's the last thing we do, right? We think we can design HR programs that meet everybody's needs when we need to take a more individual approach and then create buckets of benefits. But also what I was going to add to that is sorry, I just lost my thought. I was so excited to share it.
You're on a really interesting topic, and I think it's fascinating. So what we often find is sometimes people don't necessarily know what they want, or just don't necessarily know how to communicate what they want, because there's
Absolutely.
almost fear of offending or fear of potentially stepping on somebody else's toes. And we actually find we've used that work orientation assessment to help managers get a better idea of what their direct reports want out of their life and their career. We call it manager insights, but essentially it allows, let's say if you've got, a direct report that's job oriented, great. What would incentivize them? An extra day of vacation. Why? Because they want to be with their family. That motivates them. If they're career-oriented, the opportunity to learn a new credential because they want to work up the ladder. They want to upskill themselves. And if they're calling-oriented, having a sit-down, consistent 30-minute conversation about their work, how it's impacting the community and their company, and really how they fit in the grand scheme of the whole puzzle piece.
Yes.
So, yeah, I think you're talking about something really interesting, Stefanie. So, yeah.
There's so much... there's so much, I don't want to say opportunity because that's the word, but for misunderstanding and miscommunication. Because look, if you're a Gen X and you have the position of authority, you're going to be a guy or girl who's like, I do it all myself. I can't be vulnerable. I cannot lean on anyone. I will appear to be weak. So imagine having someone like that at the helm. Not a bad thing, not a good thing, not a bad thing. It's just their way of communicating. And then the misinterpretation from someone that could be a millennial or from the baby boomer to say, wow, they live in this silo and I can't talk to them. They're not approachable, with just a tiny little nip and tuck to that, explaining and how their work orientations are different and understanding the communication gaps. Oh my gosh, it could be nirvana,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a little bit of vulnerability there is going to take you a long, long way. Because again, I'm a Gen Xer. I'm a quintessential Gen Xer, latchkey kid, watching MTV after school when I wasn't allowed to, really. But think about the problem solving and independent skills that we learned as children. Like, those don't go away. And that's what makes us awesome as Gen Xers. But as leaders, probably makes us seem a little standoffish, a little, well, why don't you just figure it out? Like, just figure it out. That's what we do. Well, that's what we've been doing since we were 8. Doesn't mean that's how the world necessarily works anymore.
So fascinating. Gosh.
Yeah. I mean, leaders don't spend enough time describing the vision, the mission, the values, the purpose of work, like, period. And so then employees don't have enough information or context to understand how their work connects to it. There's a lot of work that leaders need to do there. I always tell my leaders, like, 7 by 7 by 7 is your communication plan. 7 channels, 7 messages, 7 times. That's how much you have to communicate as a leader, regardless of your generation.
That's fascinating. So you think it's the quantity of communication that is so critical to, like, really make sure that it gets through? I guess could you clarify that a little bit, Stefanie?
Yeah. So when leaders are communicating change, what I typically hear is, oh, well, I sent out an email to tell everybody what needs to be different. And then I talk to them at the meeting about how we need to change this process because of what's going on with our suppliers. And then they're super surprised when no one changes their behavior to match that new process. And it's because that's not how humans learn. We need to, just as in marketing, we need to hear things multiple times before we get it. Leaders, as they're driving strategy or some kind of change initiative, we've got to rely on repetition, multiple channels. So let's say you have one of those TVs in your break room that communicates company messages. Let's say you all use Teams. Let's say that you have some kind of bulletin board. If you're super old school, you got email, you got your Slack channels. You've got to use 7 channels to communicate to get the message across. And then you have to change up your messaging so that you're hitting at different points. So you're talking about the results, the people involved, the teams involved, and the process involved. And then you got to say all of that 7 times.
Wow.
Up with a language, though, that appeals to all of these different, like, there's different communication wording or within a company if now we have these 3 different generational.
Yep.
So how do you suggest like fixing that or
shaping it?
Pardon me?
Yeah. So shaping your communication to match those generations. So think about baby boomers. They want the memo. They want the long memo. They want all the details in one place. Send them that. Your millennials, they're used to bite-size on-demand information. Send them bite-size on-demand information. So instead of one long memo, you're breaking it up into paragraphs and sending it out on a cadence. For your Gen Xers, it depends on which end of the spectrum they're on. They're probably going to want a mix of both, but probably closer to send it to them in text in bite-size information.
That's really fascinating. I find that very interesting. How can we be more conscientious of the different generations that work within our own work? I guess we're kind of getting into this realm and this avenue of how we can be more conscientious.
Yeah.
Really, it's a dual part question of how can we be more conscientious, and really how can we be more okay with being more conscientious? I feel like if, let's say, in this scenario, if I was a baby boomer and I were to say I would rather have it all on a big memo with all the information in one spot, I find it very frustrating to have to create bite-sized chunks on a when-needed basis for millennials. And on the flip side, as a millennial, if I were to see a big, long memo, I'd be frustrated reading this. I wouldn't read it all the way through. I'd say, okay, what can I cut? What can I paste? Like, I read the first sentence from the first paragraph. I think I can try to piece it together from there. How can we be more conscientious and be more okay with being conscientious about the different generations within the workplace?
Yeah. So one of my mottos is that self-awareness will change the world. You have to understand that the way you think about the world, the way you communicate is not how the rest of the world does it. One of the first times I read a behavioral assessment on myself, I was like, oh, this is why people think I'm an asshole. Okay. All right. I get it now. And so you have to devote yourself to self-awareness. And I think you have to devote yourself to change in results, not just doing what you think needs to be done. Like if your goal is to get your company to grow by 25% this year, be all in on that to do what it takes to get your people to change, not be all in on only having to send one memo. Like that's not the point of leadership. And say, a marketer, I think, inherently understands this. A marketer knows that you craft and pilot and craft and recraft a message until it sticks. I think as leaders, we need to take on that perspective as well, and just understand that not everybody works, communicates, thinks about relationships in the same way that we do, and get over yourself. How about that? How's that good for a good baby boomer message? Just get over it, man.
That's interesting. But what are some tips and tactics we can start to practice to get into this habit? I think like this notion of like, hey, we need to be better communicating is great and all, but I know for me, I can start making big changes in my life when I can start adding small habits to my routine. Like it's not, at least in my experience, for me, it's not a big overhaul day-long seminar that gets me to change my life. It's 5 minutes committed to it every single day for a long period of time that gets big changes to happen. So what is something that I could start working on, or anybody that's watching this can start working on, is start being more conscientious of the generational gaps at work?
Yeah, great point. Great call out too. Thank you. I didn't mean to be so vague about better in communication because that doesn't fix anything. I think the first is we have to slow down and create reflection in our day. So if you have a planner of some sort, making sure you're writing down your big 3 priorities and leaving time for feedback. So if you do have a mentee, running your communication by your mentee to see how it sits with him or her. Or if you're a mentee, doing it with your mentor, whatever that is, but taking the time to get feedback before you send it out and making sure that you create reflection time in your day, which I know everyone in the rat race is like, oh, you don't understand, Stefanie, I don't have time for reflection. Reflection serves a deep purpose where we do the right kind of thinking in order to move forward in a focused way. So I think slowing down in order to go faster and creating a little bit of presence in your life so that you remember to bring in other voices is one of the first and most important steps. And I think just changing your orientation, out of your brain and being willing to get into other people's heads, being willing to ask them for their feedback. How does this land? How does this sit with you? Before you send it out to the masses. For those of us in the innovation space, we know the value of piloting and beta testing certain things, making sure that before you launch something company-wide or department-wide, you pilot it with a couple of people to get the kinks out, to realize that you may have missed a couple of steps that other people need before you go whole hog and send something out to the entire company.
But it's important to get a buy-in from the leadership to build in time within an organization for self-awareness and slowing down and creating reflection, right? I mean, you can't be the one that goes, hey, I'm going to go off into meditation and do my OMS, and then that's not the way the company runs, right? You'd be out of there. So it's actually a totalitarian buy-in, right?
Well, I think someone's got to be the one to break the habit. Maybe you don't announce to the whole company like, hey, I spend the first 15 minutes of my day reflecting on what I learned from yesterday and what I'm going to do today. You just do it and let other people see the benefits. So sometimes you do have to get buy-in and weigh in from other people around you. Sometimes you just got to do the right thing so that you can start to change the systems. I think a lot of us think that change happens from the top down, and actually change happens from the middle out through the rest of the company. And so for mid-level leaders who want to see some cultural change, it's on you to begin demonstrating those behaviors so that you're modeling the way for the rest of the culture.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And one thing I do want to just jump in on is, I know you had mentioned it before, but we don't like necessarily using the term mentee because it insinuates a hierarchy between the relationship. It insinuates. So I think self-reflection is so critical, but it shouldn't just be like a thing that is done by somebody who's more in a junior position. It should be done by both people, because if we're taking true credence to this relationship and saying to ourselves, I can learn from this person just as much as they can learn from me, we're now putting ourselves into a mental framework where we're not above each other, but are actually on the same level and are expected then to be committed to the same thing. So we're both expected to be self-reflecting. We're both expected to be coming in prepared to our mentor meetings. And I just wanted to make that one minor note.
No, I love it. I mean, I think that's a great distinction. And you're right. I reflected a hierarchy there that isn't the most helpful. As a baby boomer is going to be like, well, what do you mean I have to learn from someone who's 25 years old? Maybe an unself-aware baby boomer. So I think that'd be fascinating to hear someone like that react to a mentoring relationship versus a mentoring and mentee relationship.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, we hear that sometimes, and really the key here is you're not. Really, the big thing we want to fight against is this whole notion of like, I'm more than happy to be a mentor, but I'm not actually interested in getting a mentor myself. When we hear that, it's like the cringe moment where like the intentions are incredible. We know you want to give back your knowledge, your insights, but the best way to give back that knowledge and insight is also being open to listening. What we find is that sometimes the best way of learning is to teach. And so by allowing the person you're in a mentoring relationship to teach you something that you either taught them or teach you something you never considered before, that can be so powerful for that relationship to thrive. And as long as you're open to learning it and saying, you know what, this is cool. I've learned something I never really considered before. You put yourself on an even playing field. It's not a position of weakness. It's a position of growth and strength and vulnerability, which is strength and growth within that.
Yes.
Just, hey, I don't know everything.
And
yeah,
Stefanie,
absolutely.
I'm wondering if you can add insight into what Garrett's saying about we approach people who are more than happy to be a mentor, but are not in any way interested in a peer thing or to be mentored themselves. What generation first do you think they come from? And two is, why do you think that is? Like, what in their experiences may make them reluctant or defensive in that opportunity?
Yeah. So oftentimes what I experience with my clients who are baby boomers, they've never had to clearly articulate their leadership style, work expectations, what they expect from other people, how we learn in this culture, because of the command and control style that they learned from their bosses and have continued to demonstrate. And so I would say more likely in that generation, not all by any stretch of the imagination, but some of those folks, it feels like they're being put on the spot and like they don't know what they're talking about because they've never been forced to create that kind of clarity given the old school ways of managing that worked up until the late 90s-ish. Even then, it probably didn't work well. But that's how Gen Xers learned. Gen Xers learned and were trained by learning through the fire hose. I just told you what to do, and you go and you figure it out, and we were equipped for it. And so with millennials, the frustration that baby boomers really experience is millennials are like, okay, I've been taught to learn by being given the directions and told how to be successful. And baby boomers are like, why should I have to tell you any of that? You just go and figure it out. This is what you do, just like I did, just like your boss before you. And so there's a resistance there and I think there's some insecurity there because they've just never been forced to provide that kind of clarity because the management styles, the leadership styles that they learned from didn't have any of that because it relied much more on command and control, hierarchy, just go figure it out versus a more modern way of learning.
So do you think there's some imposter syndrome cognition there? Like I don't know how I got here. Cause we've talked about that in another interview about how sometimes if you don't want to be called out because you have this huge weight on your shoulders that you're supposed to know it all. And maybe you got there through being promoted, but weren't necessarily leadership, right?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, imposter syndrome exists at every single level with every single person at a variety of stages in their life. But it's, I don't know if it's a confidence issue or a inability to articulate clearly. This notion of a company having a vision for the world, a mission in this world, it's actually relatively new in modern work culture. Not that it hasn't been around, but it's relatively new in terms of most businesses trying to adopt that. And so baby boomers just haven't had to adapt to that as much. And so I think there's an inability to communicate effectively. Oftentimes the skill set is there. And as baby boomers, especially, so I work with a lot of consulting firms, the baby boomers are the experts and they have an unconscious competence to their work. And so they actually don't know all that they know. And it's really hard to train somebody when you can't articulate how you learned everything that you know of over 40 years of your career to someone who's brand new. That is, in terms of technical skill, that may not always be the best match.
That's awesome. Well, Stefanie, this has been a fantastic lunch and learn. I feel like we've learned a lot about generational differences in the workplace and just in a mentoring relationship. I think this is something that we can apply in any professional circumstance or atmosphere, whether we're the leader of our company or we're a professional within our company. I think this has been extremely valuable. How can our audience learn more about your work? How can they learn more about you? How can they connect with you? How can they, just connect with your work and follow up if they're interested in learning more about what you do?
Yeah, thank you. So if you follow me at Stefanie Krievens, or if you go to the website, StefanieKrievens.com, I'd be honored if you join the newsletter list. I send out weekly tips on change management, communication, leadership, primarily for my Gen Xers, who are my people, and I'm trying to help you lead more effectively. But if you also want insight into that world, I'd love to have you. I mean, the tips apply to all generations, but those are mostly the people that I work with. But yeah, if you want tips and tools and communication tricks in that area, StefanieKrievens.com. There's a whole set of resources there for you.
Awesome. Stefanie, thanks for being here. Tori, thanks for being my co-host. Everybody, thank you all for being here on this Lunch and Learn. Have a wonderful rest of your day. See you, everybody.